Hi, this is Cameron Murray, and this is my Module 8 data analysis. I did create a video as well as a presentation with my data, and I've also uploaded my data as a PDF as well as the presentation and the assessment, so that is available on my discussion post. So this is my data that I collected from a verb and vocabulary activity. So the scores are out of 35, and this is based on 2 of my classes. Those are my level 1 classes. So in one class I have 19 students, and in the other I have 13. And these are essentially just their student ID, how I coded the data rather. So these are the ID numbers that I used for the students in each class, and then the scores that they each got out of 35. And this is how I started my analyzation of the data. So this is more visible on my PDF of the data, the spreadsheets that I made, but essentially I took all of the scores and calculated the mean. This is pretty easy to do in Excel or any other spreadsheet, really. I believe Google Sheets does the same thing. So essentially, I calculated this using the average function and figured out that the mean of group 1 was a 29.79. The median was a 32. Again, pretty easy to type in a function to find the median. And then for the mode, I found that group 1 scored most frequently or most commonly at 35. So that's actually the 100% mark. The standard deviation for this group was 5.84, and the standard deviation here is maybe a little bit higher, but I think it can be kind of tricky given the sample size that I was using. When I actually conduct my action research, I think it will be better because my action research will focus on both of the classes combined rather than separately. My main goal is just to see how they perform in different categories of vocabulary acquisition strategies and then them being assessed in that way. So I think that will probably help with a larger sample size, but as I was working, that was maybe kind of a concern. But again, this group only has 19 students, so the number of the sample size here is only 19. In group 2, a smaller sample size here of just 13, I found that the mean for this set of data was 28.54, so a little bit lower than group 1. The median was 28, again a bit lower, and then the mode was 25. So if we remember back to group 1, that mode was 35, and here we have 25, so that's significantly different, and a potential area of interest for this set of data. The standard deviation here is a bit lower, so that's better to see, but overall the numbers were slightly lower than group 1's scores, so also an interesting point. The final thing that I did for the inferential part of this, even though again I'm analyzing data that I'm not going to be analyzing exactly this way, it is similar to how I plan to be using my data in my action research, but not quite the same. But I found that the t-test, the t number equals 0.6763. So this basically just indicated to me that the groups were pretty similar. Probably a good thing to see, given the fact that it's not really testing two different, it's not like I had an experimental group. So they both learned the same way, so they should be pretty similar. And then the p-value that I found was 0.5040. So here p is greater than 0.05, and so I found that there is no statistical significance. Again, probably a good thing, considering I'm not really testing any sort of hypothesis here. Both sets of students learned the same way, the same amount of time, more or less, practiced essentially the same way, at least at school. And so, again, not really expecting to see any sort of statistical significance. So then I moved on to my data interpretation. So based on the things that I found when I analyzed the data, in terms of learning, I think that it shows that my students have a general understanding. The lower achieving class, so that would have been group 2, it may need some additional support to kind of raise the scores a bit. So going back and maybe reteaching certain areas, taking a look at the specific questions and things like that they got wrong. And then additionally, I think it may just mean that some students need more time to practice with the vocabulary and verb conjugations and things like that. Most of that I'm basing off of the fact that there's no experimental group, so the numbers are showing a little bit lower in group 2 across the board, really. And so there may be a need for more practice as opposed to just determining that whatever I did in group 2 is worse than what I did in group 1 in terms of teaching and providing practice activities. So that leads me into the teaching part of this. I would say that the data shows that there was some fairly consistent instruction. The groups were similar according to the t-test. And there is some potential for improvement, given the fact that the scores, at least in group 2, most of them were not toward the 100% side. So perhaps I can reconsider certain things, especially if I would take a closer look at the different questions that were asked and what questions or what responses were specifically wrong. So that could give me more insight into how I need to shape instruction from then on out. But mostly effective overall. Both averages were pretty good. So when looking at it more generally, I think that's what the data could be telling me. The third thing I took a look at were improvements. So kind of tying this back into the learning and teaching a bit, probably implementing additional practice would be helpful, especially prior to taking an assessment. Now this was a practice activity, but if it were an assessment, that would definitely indicate that more practice is needed. But this also points to that more practice might be needed before an assessment. This also suggests that maybe there is opportunity for more specific feedback. So again, if students are consistently getting questions pertaining to the verb conjugations wrong, perhaps more specific feedback is needed, more practice activities are needed dealing with that. And it also points to the potential for mastery assessment, using something, or at least considering using something, testing it to see how that would improve my students' understanding overall. Yeah, so the next and last piece of my data interpretation were just some considerations. So I'm going to go back to the concept that this was a comparison of two classes, two German 1 classes. They learned the same things, more or less. So obviously it's two different classes, so things could have been a little different. They received the same instruction, the same practice activities. And then the last thing there is that the reliability test isn't super applicable here. So yeah, it's different from my action research where I might need to focus more on the reliability test, but I did use it here just to kind of get a little bit more accustomed to it and figuring out how to analyze it and interpret it. But yeah, the reliability test maybe isn't exactly what would be used normally for conducting some sort of data analysis like this.